Hi, everyone. So today I've got a guest with me, Avery Hilton. And what we wanted to remind you guys is that while you're out walking and biking every day, right, to brighten up that mood, we want you guys to be safe. And so we are wearing our helmets, right? Because when we ride bikes or scooters or skateboards, we always want to make sure that we are safe. Okay. So we're going to read you a book today also. And the book is called Paddington Bear, one of Avery's favorites. So she's going to read a little bit, and I'm going to be reading a little bit too. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, because Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were waiting to meet their daughter Judy when Mr. Brown noticed something small and furry half hidden behind some bicycles. It looks like a bear, he said. A bear? Repeated Miss Brown. In Paddington Station? Don't be silly, Henry. That can't be. But Mr. Brown was right. It was sitting on an old leather suitcase marked Wanted on Voyage, and as they drew near it, it stood up and politely raised its hat. Good afternoon, it said. May I help you? That's very kind of you, said Mr. Brown. But, as a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you. You're a very small bear to be all alone in a station, said Mrs. Brown. Where are you from?
The bear looked around carefully for replying. Darkest Peru, I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway.
You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America by yourself, exclaimed Mrs. Brown. Whatever did you do for food? Unlocking the suitcase with a small key, the bear took out an almost empty glass jar. I ate marmalade, it said. Bears like marmalade.
Mrs. Brown took a closer look at the label around the bear's neck. It said, "Quiet, simply. Please look after this bear. Thank you."
Oh, Henry, she cried. We can't just leave him here. There's no knowing what might happen to him. Can't he come home and stay with us? Stay with us? Repeated Mr. Brown nervously. He looked down at the bear. Would you like that? He asked. That is, he added hastily, if you have nothing else planned. Oh, yes, replied the bear. I would like that very much. I've nowhere to go, and everyone seems in such a hurry. That settles it, said Mrs. Brown. Now you must be thirsty after your journey. Mr. Brown will buy you a nice cup of tea while I go and meet our daughter Judy. But Mary, said Mr. Brown, we don't even know his name. Mrs. Brown thought for a moment. I know, she said. We can call him Paddington, after the station. Paddington, the bear tested it several times to make sure it sounds very important. Mr. Brown tried it out next. Follow me, Paddington, he said. I'll take you to the restaurant. Paddington had never been inside a restaurant before, and he was very excited when he saw what Mr. Brown had bought him. Go ahead, you read that one.
He was so hungry and thirsty he didn't know what to do at first. Eat or drink? I think I'll try doing both at the same time, if you don't mind, he announced. Without waiting for a reply, he climbed up onto the table and promptly stepped on a large cream and jam cake. Mr. Brown started out of the window, pretending he had tea with the bear in Paddington Station every day of his life.
Oh no. Henry, cried Mrs. Brown when she arrived with Judy. What are you doing with that poor bear? He's covered in jam and cream. Paddington jumped out to raise his hat. In his haste, he slipped on a patch of strawberry jam and fell over backwards into his cup of tea. I think we'd better go before anything else happens, said Mr. Brown. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw. Come along, she said. We'll take you home and you can meet Mrs. Bird and my brother, Jonathan. Mr. Brown led the way to a waiting taxi. Number 32 Windsor Gardens, please, he said. The driver stared at Paddington. Bear is extra? Sticky Bears is twice as much. And make sure none of it comes off on my interior. It was clean when I set out this morning. The Browns climbed into the back of the taxi and Paddington stood up on a little tip-up seat behind the driver so that he could see where they were going. The sun was shining as they drove out of the station, and there were cars and big red buses everywhere. Paddington waved to some people waiting at a bus stop, and several of them waved back. One man even raised his hat. It was all very friendly. Paddington tapped the taxi driver on the shoulder. Isn't it a bit like Darkest Peru, he announced. The man jumped out at the sound of Paddington's voice. Cream, he said bitterly. All over me, new coat. There was a bang as he slid the little window down behind him shut. Oh dear, Henry murmured Mrs. Brown. I wonder if we're doing the right thing. Fortunately, before anyone had time to answer, they arrived at Windsor Gardens. Judy helped Paddington out of the taxi, and together they went up some steps towards a green front door. Now you're going to meet Mrs. Bird, said Judy. She looks after us. She's a bit fierce at times, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you'll like her. Paddington peered at his reflection in the brightly polished letterbox. I'm sure I shall, if you say so, he replied. The thing is, will she like me? Goodness gracious, exclaimed Mrs. Bird. What have you got there? It's not a what, said Judy. It's a bear. His name's Paddington, and he's coming to stay with us. A bear, said Mrs. Bird, as Paddington raised his hat. Well, he has good manners. I'd say that for him. I'm afraid I stepped into some cream cakes by mistake, said Paddington. I can see that, said Mrs. Bird. I'd better get Jonathan to run a bath. I dare say you'll be wanting some marmalade too. I think she likes you, whispered Judy.
While Jonathan ran the water, Judy gave Paddington some soap and a towel, but Paddington was much too busy to bother with either. First he tried writing his name in the steam on the mirror, then he used Mr. Brown's shaving cream to draw a map of Peru on the floor.
It wasn't until a drip landed on his head that he remembered he was supposed to be having a bath. He soon discovered that wasn't as easy as it sounded. It's one thing climbing into a bath, but quite another matter getting out again, especially when the tub is full of water and your eyes are covered in soap. Paddington tried calling out, help! At first in a very quiet voice, so as to not disturb anyone. Then very loudly, help, help! When that didn't work, he began bailing the water out with his hat, but the hat had several holes in it, and his map of Peru soon turned into a sea of foam. Suddenly, Jonathan and Judy burst into the bathroom and lifted a dripping Paddington onto the floor. Thank goodness you're all right, cried Judy. Fancy making all this mess, said Jonathan admirably. Even I've never made as much mess as this. Why didn't you pull the plug out? Oh, said Paddington, I never thought of that. When Paddington came downstairs, he looked so clean, no one could possibly cross with him. His fur was all soft and silky, his nose gleamed, and his paws had lost all traces of the jam and cream.
The Browns made room for him in a small armchair by the fire, and and Mrs. Bird brought him a pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast.
"Now," said Mrs. Brown, "you must tell us all about yourself. I'm sure you must have had lots of adventures." "I have," said Paddington earnestly. "Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of bear." He settled back in his armchair and stretched out his toes toward the fire. "I was brought up by my Aunt Lucy in darkest Peru," he began. "But then she had to go into a home for retired bears in Lima." He closed his eyes thoughtfully, and a hush fell over the room as everyone waited expectantly.
After a while, when nothing happened, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown could loudly then could Mr. Brown coughed loudly. Then he reached across and poked Paddington with his finger. Well, I never," said Mrs. Brown. I do believe he's fast asleep. Are you surprised?" asked Mrs. Brown. The end.
The end. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that. Avery enjoyed it too, being in here. Remember, when you're out and about and you're getting outside during this time when we're all sheltering in place, remember, it's very important for your mood and just for the energy of kids and adults and everybody. Go out and get some sunshine, especially around the thunder. We had some thunder today here in Gilroy. All right? Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.